Beneath the blinding sun of North Africa, beyond the golden dunes and the shifting winds of time, lies a question that has haunted scholars, explorers, and dreamers for centuries. How did a civilization born in the middle of an unforgiving desert not only survive, but thrive for more than 3,000 years? Before Greece, before Rome, before the first spark of the Western world, there was Egypt, an empire of stone and spirit, carved between life and death, time and eternity. Empire's Historical welcomes you. Welcome to a journey into one of the most enduring enigmas in human history, a civilization that seemed to understand eternity better than any other. Today, we're going to descend into the sands of time to uncover the secret behind the immortality of ancient Egypt. Imagine this. The year is 3100 BCE. The world is still young. Humanity is scattered, fragile, searching for meaning. Yet somewhere along the gentle curve of the Nile, a people learn to turn chaos into order. Every year, the river floods and recedes, creating a rhythm as precise as the heartbeat of the earth itself. It brings destruction and rebirth. It gives famine and fortune. The Egyptians learned to read this rhythm, to live by it, to worship it. Out of this fragile harmony between nature and man, between life and the afterlife, rises a civilization so structured, so balanced, that it endures longer than any kingdom before or after it. From the very beginning, Egypt was more than a kingdom. It was an idea. The idea that order could triumph over chaos, that death was not an end but a transformation, and that a man, if he ruled justly, could become divine. To the Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just a river, it was the spinal cord of creation. The desert that bordered it wasn't emptiness. It was protection, isolation, and sanctity. Every grain of sand became a witness to a people who dared to believe they could outlive time itself. But here's the paradox. For a civilization obsessed with eternity, Egypt was surrounded by impermanence. Floods destroyed harvests, droughts broke dynasties, invaders came and went. Yet through it all, Egypt remained. Its gods reborn under new names, its temples rebuilt atop ruins, its spirit resurrected again and again. What power, what faith, what secret allowed them to do this? Was it the brilliance of their kings, the discipline of their scribes, the devotion of their priests? Or was it something far deeper? A belief encoded in their very way of life, that balance, not conquest, sustains the world? Think of the Great Pyramids, those impossible monuments piercing the desert sky. For thousands of years they've stood not as tombs of the dead, but as proof that humanity can dream beyond mortality. Beneath their shadows, dynasties rose and fell, conquerors came and vanished, yet the stones remained unmoved, whispering through millennia. Nothing truly dies if it is built on order and purpose. Empires are supposed to fade. Babylon fell to dust. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all rose in brilliance and vanished in pride. But Egypt did something none of them could. It endured. It evolved without losing itself. When foreigners ruled, Egypt absorbed them, reshaped them, and taught them the rhythm of the Nile. The Libyans, the Nubians, the Persians, the Greeks, all of them came believing they could conquer Egypt. Yet every single one left behind a trace of themselves within her, and in return, carried a piece of her soul away. In this exchange, Egypt achieved something greater than power, permanence. Perhaps that is the true secret. Not the might of armies or the genius of builders, but the art of balance. The Egyptians called it Mat, the eternal harmony between truth, justice, and the cosmic order. Pharaohs ruled not merely as kings, but as guardians of this balance. Every law, every temple, every ritual was designed to preserve it. When Mat was kept, the Nile flowed, the people prospered, and the kingdom endured. When it was broken, chaos, Isfet, returned, and Egypt fell into darkness. Yet even then, like the river that always returns to its banks, Egypt found her way back to equilibrium. As centuries passed, the desert devoured cities. Dynasties turned to dust, and languages died. But Egypt never disappeared. Its symbols, the Eye of Horus, the Ankh, the scarab, still pulse through the veins of modern culture. Its architectural proportions shaped the temples of Greece and the cathedrals of Europe. Its ideas of resurrection inspired entire religions. Somewhere, deep down, we are all heirs of Egypt's obsession with eternity. But what if this endurance came at a cost? What if the very pursuit of eternity blinded them to the inevitability of change? What if their secret to survival was also their curse? Because when the Romans finally came, Egypt no longer resisted. It surrendered, tired, magnificent, immortal in ruin. And yet even then, the story did not end. For Egypt had already transcended its geography, its rulers, its language. It had become an idea that could not be conquered, a whisper in the desert wind, a name carved forever into the consciousness of mankind. As we unfold this story, remember this. Egypt's greatness didn't lie in its pyramids or pharaohs. It lay in its faith that everything, even death, has purpose. And that belief allowed it to outlast empires, kings, and centuries. Today, when modern civilizations rise and fall in decades, when our technology races ahead of our wisdom, perhaps the lesson of Egypt is more relevant than ever. A society survives not by power, but by harmony. Not by expansion, but by balance. Not by conquering others, but by mastering itself. This is the mystery of Egypt's endurance, a civilization that should have perished countless times, yet somehow, like the phoenix, kept rising from its own ashes. And in that resurrection lies a message for all of us. The true measure of a civilization is not how high it rises, but how deeply it roots itself in meaning. If you find yourself captivated by the echoes of this ancient land, by its beauty, its wisdom, and the haunting question of how it endured, then stay with us. The story you are about to hear is not just history, it is a mirror, reflecting everything we are and everything we could become. Empires. Historical invites you to step beyond time, to walk beside the pharaohs, to touch the eternal sands, and to discover the secret of immortality that no empire has ever fully understood. And before we begin this incredible journey through 3,000 years of wonder and wisdom, take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe to Empires Historical and help us continue bringing the past to life. Because the more we understand where we came from, the better we can understand who we truly are. Long before the first stone of the pyramids was laid, before the word Pharaoh was ever spoken, before history itself had a name, there was only the river. The Nile, vast and patient, carved its silver thread through the desert like the pulse of a sleeping god. Around it the wind moved over an empty land, and the people of North Africa lived as wanderers beneath a sun that gave life and death in equal measure. It was here, between the shifting sands and the steady flood, that the story of Egypt began. A story not of conquest but of awakening. 10,000 years before the Common Era, the Sahara was not yet the ocean of sand we know today. It was green, wet, alive with herds and hunters. People followed the rains and the stars, moving with the seasons, leaving behind faint traces of their lives, paintings of animals on cave walls, the echo of rituals that celebrated birth, death, and the mysterious balance between them. But the world was changing. The rains withdrew, the rivers shrank, and the land hardened. The Sahara began its slow transformation into desert, and with it came a great migration. The hunters and gatherers, driven by thirst and hunger, turned eastward, toward the river that still flowed even when all else failed. The Nile became not only their refuge, but their destiny. Along its banks, they built shelters, then villages. They learned to tame the rhythm of the flood, to sow as the waters receded and reap before they rose again. They studied the stars to predict the seasons, and in doing so, they created the first calendars known to humankind. From necessity was born understanding. From understanding, belief. The Nile was no longer just a river. It was a god, a giver of life, a mirror of eternity. To live by its rhythm was to live in harmony with the cosmos. With stability came imagination. Clay became pottery. Symbols scratched onto shards of stone began to take meaning. Communities traded, argued, reconciled. Leadership emerged, not from bloodline or wealth, but from wisdom and the ability to foresee the flood. The elders, the priests, the dreamers, they began to tell stories of the gods who ruled the sky, of the spirits in the earth, of the serpent that slept beneath the river's heart. These were not just myths, they were attempts to understand the vast, invisible structure of existence. And slowly, through trial and reverence, the Egyptians discovered their first great truth, that life was a circle, not a line. Death was not an end, but a return. As generations passed, the small villages grew into towns. In the south, the land of Upper Egypt, where the river ran narrow between cliffs, developed faster than the marshy delta to the north. There, the people built shrines and carved symbols of power into ivory and stone. Their culture became distinct, organized, creative, fiercely spiritual. This southern kingdom, known to history as Nakada, began to dominate its neighbors through trade and diplomacy. From its artisans came fine pottery, weapons of copper, and intricate jewelry, each piece carrying the rhythm of the river and the pulse of belief. But progress is never still. As the population swelled and resources strained, the delicate balance of coexistence began to shift toward competition. The fertile Nile Valley could no longer sustain dozens of small kingdoms. It demanded unity, and from this crucible of necessity, a single vision began to take shape. A vision of one land, one ruler, one divine order to mirror the harmony of the river itself. It was during this time that the first symbols of kingship appeared. The double crown, red for the northern delta, white for the southern highlands, became emblems of authority. The falcon, soaring above the cliffs, came to represent Horus, the divine protector of the king. The earliest hieroglyphs were carved not as decoration, but as declarations of power, names of rulers, victories, offerings to the gods. Civilization was no longer a dream, it was being written into stone. At the heart of this transformation was a man whose name would echo through eternity, Narmer. Around 3100 BCE, he emerged from the south, uniting the two lands under a single banner. His conquest was not merely political, it was spiritual. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt symbolized the marriage of duality, life and death, chaos and order, desert and river. The world, as the Egyptians saw it, had found its balance once more. To them, Narmer was not just a king, he was the living embodiment of Ma'at, the cosmic truth that holds the universe together. The unification of Egypt under Narmer marked the dawn of recorded history. For the first time, humanity had a nation, not just a tribe or a city-state, but a true civilization bound by common language, faith, and law. The capital, Memphis, was founded near the meeting of the two lands, a deliberate choice, the physical heart of a spiritual idea. From there, the pharaoh ruled as both mortal and divine, a bridge between the people and the gods. The early Egyptians did not merely survive, they created a model for civilization itself. They mastered irrigation, built granaries to store food against famine, and developed trade routes that reached the Levant and Nubia. Their artisans worked gold and copper. Their scribes recorded events in hieroglyphs, and their priests refined the rituals that would define Egyptian religion for millennia. Yet even amid their achievements, they never forgot the rhythm that had given them life. Every year, as the river rose and receded, they celebrated the endless cycle of creation and renewal. The Nile's pulse had become the heartbeat of an empire unborn. Still, beneath this growing order lay the shadow of fragility. They knew the river could turn against them, that one failed flood could bring famine, that the favor of the gods was never guaranteed. And so they built not only with stone but with reverence, with an awareness that everything from the smallest grain of sand to the highest star was connected. This awareness became their foundation. It would carry them through centuries of glory and collapse, faith and doubt, until their name was written not just on earth, but in eternity. When we speak of Egypt's greatness, we often think of its monuments, its pharaohs, its gold, but its true beginning lies here, in the quiet moment when a people learned to listen to a river, and in that listening, discovered themselves. The dawn of civilization was not born in conquest, but in comprehension. The realization that survival required not domination, but balance. Out of this understanding, Egypt was born, not as a kingdom of men, but as a reflection of the eternal harmony that governs the cosmos. That is the true beginning of the Egyptian miracle. A civilization rooted not in power, but in rhythm, not in ambition, but in reverence. And as the sun rose each day over the waters of the Nile, the people looked to it not as something to control, but as something to understand. For in its light, they saw a reflection of their own soul, endless, enduring, and divine. When Narmer united the two lands of Egypt, he did more than bind kingdoms. He ignited an idea that a single order could reflect the divine structure of the universe itself. From that moment, Egypt entered an age unlike any other, a time of unshakable faith, breathtaking ambition, and monumental creation. Historians would later call it the Old Kingdom, but to those who lived within it, it was simply the age when gods walked the earth as kings. In the centuries following unification, Egypt discovered what it meant to be a nation. The new rulers, the early pharaohs of the first and second dynasties, began to craft an identity built upon divine kingship. The pharaoh was no longer merely a man. He was the living Horus, the falcon who bridged the human world and the heavens. His duty was to sustain Ma'at, the cosmic order of balance, truth, and justice that kept chaos at bay. This concept was not metaphorical. To the Egyptians, it was as real as the flood of the Nile. When the king ruled with justice, the river flowed, the crops grew, and the stars held their courses. When he failed, disorder spread like a shadow over the land. This belief forged one of humanity's first true bureaucratic states. To sustain divine order on earth, Egypt required precision. Fields had to be measured, taxes recorded, floods predicted, temples supplied, and harvests stored. From the royal palace at Memphis, scribes worked day and night, inscribing numbers and decrees with reed pens on papyrus scrolls. Overseers directed laborers in every province, each nome governed by a local official bound to the pharaoh's authority. This network, an intricate web of loyalty and labor, became the invisible skeleton of the kingdom. The genius of Egypt lay not only in its architecture of stone, but in its architecture of organization. And yet, divine kingship was never content with mere efficiency. The pharaoh's rule had to be eternal, visible, and unforgettable. His body might die, but his divine essence, his Ka, would live forever. The challenge was to build something that could house eternity. The earliest kings were buried in simple rectangular tombs called mastabas, mud brick monuments that hinted at immortality but still belonged to earth. Then came a ruler whose vision transcended imagination, King Djoser. When Djoser ascended the throne around 2686 BCE, he turned to his chief architect, a man whose name would echo through millennia, Imhotep. Imhotep was more than an engineer. He was a philosopher, a priest, a physician, and a visionary. Under his genius, the mastaba was reborn. Layer upon layer of stone rose toward the sky, creating the world's first pyramid. The step pyramid of Saqqara was not merely a tomb. It was a revolution in thought and faith. For the first time, humanity defied impermanence with permanence. Standing 200 feet tall and built of limestone, the step pyramid shimmered like a stairway to the heavens. To the Egyptians, it was a literal path to eternity, a divine ladder guiding the king's soul toward the gods. Beneath it stretched a labyrinth of tunnels, chambers, and storerooms filled with offerings meant to sustain the king in the afterlife. Around it rose temples, courtyards, and shrines, all enclosed by a colossal stone wall. It was an entire city for the dead, echoing the organization of the living. and at its heart lay a single truth: that the pharaoh's eternity guaranteed Egypt's stability. This architectural miracle marked the beginning of Egypt's golden age. Each ruler sought to surpass his predecessor, and each monument became an offering not just to the gods, but to time itself. The Fourth Dynasty witnessed the zenith of this ambition. Kings like Sneferu perfected pyramid construction, transforming Djoser's stepped form into smooth, true pyramids. His red pyramid and the bent pyramid at Dashur stand as experiments in perfection, testaments to a civilization learning to bend stone to its will. Then came Sneferu's son, Khufu, whose name would become synonymous with eternity. His monument, the Great Pyramid of Giza, defied comprehension. Rising over 480 feet and built from more than 2 million limestone blocks, it aligned almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, deviating from true north by less than a fraction of a degree. No mortar bound its stones, yet they have endured earthquakes and centuries of desert wind. For 3,800 years, it remained the tallest structure on Earth, a mountain of human purpose. But the Great Pyramid was not only an engineering miracle, it was a theological one. Its internal passages pointed toward specific stars in Orion and Sirius, constellations associated with Osiris and Isis, the gods of death and resurrection. To the Egyptians, the pharaoh's spirit would ascend through those shafts, joining the gods to ensure the sun would rise each day. The pyramid was not a tomb. It was a machine for resurrection. Khufu's successors, Khafre and Menkaure, built their own pyramids beside his, creating the Giza Plateau, a celestial map etched into the earth. The Sphinx, with its human face and lion's body, guarded the sacred necropolis, symbolizing the eternal unity of wisdom and strength. Every brick, every carving, every alignment spoke of one message: that the pharaoh was divine order made flesh, the living guarantor of life's eternal rhythm. Yet behind this splendor lay an astonishing human story. Contrary to later myths, these monuments were not built by slaves, but by organized teams of skilled workers. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages reveals communities of well-fed, proud laborers, stonecutters, architects, bakers, and brewers who saw their work as sacred service. They built not for money, but for immortality. Their songs and laughter once echoed through the quarries of Giza as they moved stones that weighed more than men could imagine. Each block they set was a prayer in stone. The Old Kingdom reached its height not merely in architecture but in ideology. The pharaoh became the axis of the universe, the living image of Ra, the sun god. The state religion declared that as long as he performed rituals, maintained justice, and offered to the gods, the world would remain in harmony. The people accepted this faith because they saw it confirmed each year when the Nile rose faithfully and the fields turned green. The entire civilization existed within this sacred rhythm, a perfect circle of cosmic balance. But perfection, by its nature, is fragile. As the centuries passed, the cost of greatness began to weigh on Egypt's foundations. Pyramid building consumed enormous resources. The vast bureaucracy, once the kingdom's strength, became bloated. Distant officials grew powerful and independent. Droughts began to trouble the Nile, and when floods failed, the people looked to the pharaoh for salvation. Yet even a god-king could not command the river. By the end of the 6th dynasty, under Pharaoh Pepi II, whose reign may have lasted over 90 years, the once immortal structure of divine order began to crack. The local governors, or nomarchs, became autonomous. The central government faltered, unable to feed its people or sustain the illusion of eternal stability. The concept of Maat, so carefully guarded for centuries, wavered. Egypt's first great age of light slipped into shadow, and so the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, came to its quiet end, not with a cataclysm, but with a slow unraveling of faith. Yet even in decline, it left behind an inheritance no civilization could match: the idea that humans could reach for eternity and touch it. The stones of Giza still stand, their edges softened by time, but their meaning intact, a message carved for all who would listen. For in every block, in every hieroglyph, in every silent chamber of those colossal tombs echoes the voice of the Old Kingdom. That order is stronger than chaos, that faith can outlast centuries, and that in building for eternity, a people can transcend death itself. The splendor of the Old Kingdom did not end with a fall, but with a quiet fading, like the slow dimming of the sun before night. For centuries, Egypt had stood as the axis of the world, its kings worshipped as gods, its pyramids defying mortality itself. But beneath the grandeur, cracks had begun to spread. The river that once promised life became unpredictable. The voice of the gods, once clear through the Pharaoh, grew distant. What followed was not a single collapse, but a slow unraveling, a descent into doubt, hunger, and silence. Historians call it the First Intermediate Period, yet to those who lived through it, it was a time when the world lost its center. The Nile, once the source of divine rhythm, betrayed its people. Floods that had sustained millions began to fail. The river ran shallow, crops withered in the sun, and famine crept like a shadow through the valley. The same land that had fed empires for centuries now could not sustain even its children. Hungry eyes turned toward the pyramids, those immense monuments to divine kingship, and saw not glory, but the waste of stone. The belief that the pharaoh was the guarantor of order, the living link to the gods, began to fracture. When the king could no longer summon the flood, could he still claim to hold the favor of heaven? Pepi II, the last great pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, reigned longer than any ruler before him, perhaps more than 90 years. But longevity became his curse. As he aged, the machinery of the state began to decay. His officials, once loyal servants of the crown, grew powerful in their own provinces. These nomarchs, the governors of Egypt's nomes, started to rule as kings in miniature. They collected their own taxes, built their own tombs, and commanded their own armies. The idea of one Egypt began to dissolve. When Pepi II finally died, there was no strong heir, no unifying vision. The throne became a prize to be seized, not inherited. The royal line fragmented, and local dynasties emerged across the land. The once sacred bureaucracy that had recorded every grain of wheat and every drop of water now fell silent. Without the pharaoh's oversight, records ceased, temples decayed, and the priests lost their voice. Egypt's great experiment in divine order collapsed under its own weight. What came next was chaos. Not the chaos of conquest or invasion, but the chaos of disunity. The country that had been one became many. The northern cities around Heracleopolis Magna claimed legitimacy as the rightful heirs of Memphis. In the south, Thebes rose in defiance, a new power under local lords who dreamed of restoring the old glory. Between them stretched a land divided not only by politics, but by despair. Bandits roamed the roads, granaries were raided, and villages turned against one another. The Nile, indifferent to human suffering, continued its endless flow toward the sea, carrying with it the remnants of a broken civilization. Yet even in collapse, Egypt did not lose its soul. From the anguish of these years emerged a new kind of literature, introspective, haunting, and deeply human. It was as if the entire nation began to ask itself the question, what went wrong? The old hymns of praise to the pharaoh were replaced by laments and confessions. In the admonitions of Ipuwer, a poet described a world turned upside down, the poor now rich, the rich now poor, the river dry, the tombs open, and the gods silent. The text was not merely complaint, it was reflection. For the first time, Egyptians looked inward, questioning the nature of justice, power, and fate. The teaching for King Merakare, a father's counsel to his son, reveals another kind of wisdom, hard-earned, cautious, stripped of divine certainty. It speaks of leadership not as divine right, but as responsibility. Do justice, that you may endure on earth. Calm the weeper, do not oppress the widow. Such words marked a profound shift in Egyptian consciousness. The people no longer saw kingship as eternal or unshakable. It was something fragile, dependent on human morality and wisdom. The age of blind faith was ending, and in its place, a new understanding was being born. That power must be guided by compassion, and that survival depended not on the favor of gods, but on the choices of men. While the north and south warred for dominance, Thebes began to rise as the beacon of renewal. Isolated by geography yet rich in faith, the Theban princes invoked old gods with new fervor. They worshipped Amun, the Hidden One, a deity who embodied mystery and transformation. Amun was different from the sun god Ra, who represented predictable cycles. He was the unseen force behind them, the breath within chaos. In Thebes, this idea found resonance. The people of the south saw in Amun not just divinity, but hope, the possibility that order could rise again from disorder, as the Nile always returned after drought. Meanwhile, in the north, the rulers of Heracleopolis clung to power, building fortresses and attempting to revive the memory of Memphis. But their Egypt was fractured, their influence limited to the delta. Thebes, in contrast, possessed something the north lacked, a unifying faith and a sense of destiny. Gradually, the southern rulers extended their reach, absorbing neighboring territories, reclaiming temples, and restoring the rituals that had been forgotten. It was not conquest through might, but through meaning. They promised a return to Mot, not the rigid cosmic order of the Old Kingdom, but a gentler, human-centered balance. This era, dark as it was, became the crucible in which Egypt's soul was reforged. The suffering of famine taught resilience. The collapse of kingship taught humility. The silence of the gods taught introspection. The people began to understand that divinity did not reside solely in the pharaoh, but within the order they built together, their justice, their rituals, their compassion. By 2055 BCE, Thebes, under Mentuhotep II, finally triumphed. His armies marched north, subduing Heracleopolis and reuniting the two lands. For the first time in generations, Egypt breathed again as one. The victory was not celebrated as mere conquest, it was redemption. The king took the title, "He who unites the two lands," but more importantly, he restored faith in unity itself. Under his reign, Egypt entered the Middle Kingdom, a renaissance born from ruin, a rebirth forged from memory and mourning. Looking back, the first intermediate period was not simply an age of collapse. It was a necessary silence between symphonies. The Old Kingdom had been an age of gods. The Middle Kingdom would be an age of humanity. Between them lay this fragile interlude, where Egypt learned that even the most divine order must sometimes break to be reborn. The pyramids still stood on the horizon, their peaks glowing red beneath the dying sun. But their meaning had changed. They were no longer symbols of unshakable eternity. They were reminders that eternity must be renewed with every generation. The river still flowed, though it had run thin. And within its quiet persistence, the Egyptians found their truth once more, that no darkness is final, and that even after the longest drought, the Nile always returns. When the dust of chaos settled and the cries of famine faded into silence, a new dawn broke over Egypt. From the ashes of division rose a monarch who would restore unity, order, and faith. Mentuhotep II of Thebes. His reign marked not merely the reunification of two warring lands, it marked the rebirth of a civilization. With his victory, Egypt entered what history now calls the Middle Kingdom, an age of reflection and refinement, of rediscovered harmony and renewed purpose. It was not the loud glory of empire, but the quiet majesty of recovery, the measured breathing of a nation learning once more how to live. Mentuhotep II understood what his predecessors had forgotten, that the strength of Egypt did not lie in divine absolutism, but in balance, between king and people, faith and reason, tradition and renewal. When he took the throne, Egypt had been scarred by centuries of disunity. Villages still bore the memory of famine, temples lay in ruin, and the once holy idea of kingship had been tarnished by human failure. But from his capital at Thebes, Mentuhotep built not just monuments of stone, but monuments of reconciliation. He ruled not as a distant god-king, but as a guardian of order, a mortal custodian of the divine rhythm that had nearly been lost. In the hills of Deir el-Bahari, he commissioned his mortuary temple, a structure unlike anything before it, terraced, open to the desert light, merging architecture and landscape into one sacred continuum. It was not an assertion of power, but a hymn to renewal. The temple's ascending ramps symbolized resurrection, the king's eternal return to the gods, and the rebirth of Egypt itself. Beneath the surface of its limestone walls lay a message that the cycle of death and rebirth belonged not only to kings, but to civilizations. With Thebes as the beating heart of the reunited kingdom, the machinery of state was rebuilt with careful precision. Governors once again served under royal oversight, but the lesson of the past had been learned. The power of the local nomarchs would be restrained, balanced through loyalty, oversight, and merit. The bureaucracy became both more flexible and more humane. Egypt was learning to govern itself through wisdom rather than fear. The Middle Kingdom was not an age of reckless ambition. It was an age of introspection. The Egyptians, humbled by collapse, turned their gaze inward. The literature of the time reveals a remarkable shift in consciousness. No longer content to praise the king as divine, poets and philosophers began to speak of the dignity of ordinary people and the moral duties of rulers. In the tale of the eloquent peasant, a simple farmer pleads for justice after being wronged by a corrupt official. His eloquence moves the court and becomes a parable of righteousness, that even the humblest voice deserves to be heard. Such a story would have been unthinkable in the Pyramid Age. It signaled a civilization rediscovering its conscience. Under Mentuhotep's successors, and later the 11th and 12th dynasties, Egypt entered a period of stability and prosperity that would last nearly 5 centuries. Pharaohs like Amenemhat II and his son Senusret I refined the art of kingship into a philosophy of stewardship. Amenemhat, a self-made man from outside the royal line, rose to power through intellect and discipline. He moved the capital north to Ichitawi, near the Fayum oasis, a symbolic gesture, placing the throne between Upper and Lower Egypt, between past and future. His reign blended the wisdom of Thebes with the pragmatism of Memphis. Amenemhat understood that stability required foresight. In his famous instruction of Amenemhat to his son, Senusret, written after his assassination, he warns from beyond the grave, "Trust no brother, know no friend, make no intimates." The words are bleak, yet beneath their caution lies a truth born of experience, that leadership demands vigilance, and peace is never permanent. His successor Senusret I, however, embodied the balance between strength and generosity. He expanded Egypt's borders south into Nubia, securing the gold mines and trade routes that would fuel a new age of wealth. His monuments rose across the land, not colossal in scale but graceful in design, temples aligned with the sun, obelisks reaching toward the heavens like prayers carved in stone. Trade flourished beyond the borders. Caravans ventured east into the Sinai for copper and turquoise. Ships sailed down the Red Sea toward the mysterious land of Punt, bringing back incense, ivory, and exotic animals. Egypt once more became a crossroads of the ancient world, its influence reaching from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. But what truly defined the Middle Kingdom was not expansion. It was equilibrium. The kingdom thrived not through conquest, but through balance, diplomacy, and management of its natural blessings. The Fayum Basin became the crown jewel of this era's achievement. Massive irrigation projects transformed marshland into fertile fields, an act that symbolized the restoration of harmony between man and nature. Farmers rejoiced at harvests that filled granaries, craftsmen adorned temples with delicate artistry, scribes filled papyrus rolls with hymns, letters, and philosophical reflections. This was Egypt's humanist age, an age when art spoke not only of gods and kings, but of daily life, love, and mortality. Statues from this period capture faces with individual expression, calm, introspective, and deeply human. For the first time, Egyptian art looked inward and found the soul of its people. Yet beneath this harmony, there remained the eternal awareness that balance must be maintained. The concept of Maat, the divine order, now evolved into a moral and social principle. Justice was no longer a gift bestowed by kings, but a duty shared by all. The idea of the afterlife became democratized. Not only pharaohs but commoners could aspire to eternal life, provided they lived in accordance with truth and virtue. Tomb inscriptions no longer celebrated divine lineage, but good deeds, the bread given to the hungry, the kindness shown to strangers. Egypt had become, in essence, a civilization of conscience. Toward the end of the 12th dynasty, Egypt reached the height of its stability. Senusret III, often considered the greatest king of this era, ruled as both warrior and reformer. He redefined the boundaries of the state, curbing the power of provincial lords once and for all, and strengthening central governance. His campaigns in Nubia secured the southern frontier, and his fortresses along the Nile, massive, practical, enduring, stood as symbols not of domination, but of vigilance. Yet Senusret III's true greatness lay not in his conquests, but in his vision. He reimagined kingship as service. The pharaoh was no longer a god above men, but the first servant of the gods and the people alike. After his reign, however, the line of succession weakened. The long peace had bred complacency. The 13th dynasty inherited a kingdom well built but stretched thin, its administration overextended, its wealth unevenly distributed. The old rhythm began to falter once more. In the distant delta, new powers stirred. In the deserts, foreigners began to arrive, migrants from Canaan and Syria who would one day become rulers. The Middle Kingdom did not end in destruction, but in gradual erosion, its ideals slowly fading like hieroglyphs in the sand. And yet, even in decline, the Middle Kingdom left a legacy unlike any other. It was the conscience of Egypt's civilization, the bridge between the divine absolutism of the Old Kingdom and the imperial ambition of the New. It taught that strength without justice is hollow, that kingship without compassion is tyranny, and that true order is not imposed but cultivated. As the sun set over the calm waters of the Nile, its reflection shimmering against the terraced temples of Thebes, Egypt stood at peace, not the peace of conquest, but of understanding. For the people had learned that eternity is not only carved in stone, it is lived each day in the quiet acts of fairness, wisdom, and care that bind a nation together. The Middle Kingdom was Egypt's second birth, a reminder that from the ruins of pride can rise the harmony of grace. The peace of the Middle Kingdom, once serene as the Nile's flow, began to waver under invisible currents. Prosperity had made Egypt complacent. The kings of the 13th dynasty ruled over a realm still vast in land, but fractured in spirit. Bureaucrats, no longer tempered by crisis, grew self-indulgent. The royal bloodline weakened. And beyond Egypt's eastern borders, in the restless lands of Canaan and Syria, new peoples watched with hungry eyes the fertile delta and the promise of its abundance. The river that had once united Egypt now stood as its last fragile defense against the chaos approaching from beyond the sands. The beginning of the Second Intermediate Period was not heralded by fire or invasion, but by silence. The silence of a government too paralyzed to notice the world shifting around it. Nomarchs, once restrained by the reforms of Senusret III, began to reclaim autonomy. Small dynasties rose and fell in quick succession, some ruling no more than a single city, others vanishing without trace. The once steady bureaucracy fractured into local powers, each serving its own interest. The crown, once divine, had become administrative, its aura of sanctity dimmed by mediocrity. Into this vacuum came strangers. They were traders and wanderers at first, families from the northeast who sought food and security during droughts that swept through the Levant. Egypt's borders had always been porous, its wealth a beacon to those who lived in harsher lands. The Egyptians, confident in their stability, allowed these foreigners to settle in the delta. They brought new customs, new tongues, and new tools, For years, they lived peacefully alongside the Egyptians, adapting and intermarrying. But when central power finally crumbled, their communities, strong, organized, and ambitious, rose to fill the void. They called themselves the Hekau Kasut, the rulers of foreign lands. To history, they would be known as the Hyksos. Their emergence was not an invasion in the traditional sense. It was a slow, inevitable seepage of power, as water seeps into cracks in weakened stone. The Hyksos established their capital at Avaris in the eastern delta, a city vibrant with foreign energy and innovation. There, they built temples to Egyptian gods alongside their own, blending pantheons and customs. Yet beneath the appearance of coexistence lay the reality of domination. The Hyksos controlled the delta, the agricultural heart of Egypt, and the vital trade routes that connected it to the Mediterranean and Asia. The Egyptians to the south viewed these new rulers with a mix of resentment and fascination. The Hyksos introduced technologies unknown to the Old Kingdom: the horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow, the use of bronze weapons, and new methods of fortification. Their armies moved with speed and precision that stunned the Egyptians, whose warfare had long relied on foot soldiers and ritual rather than innovation. For the first time in their long history, the people of the Nile found themselves outmatched, not by numbers, but by ingenuity. The northern lands fell under Hyksos rule, while the south, centered around Thebes, remained in Egyptian hands. There, native kings clung to a shrinking domain, their pride wounded, but their spirit unbroken. They ruled nominally as pharaohs, yet in truth, they were exiles in their own land. Between Avaris and Thebes stretched a tense frontier, a symbolic wound dividing Egypt into two souls, one foreign, one native. The Hyksos brought trade and stability to their territories, but their presence violated something sacred in the Egyptian psyche. To them, the king was more than a ruler. He was the embodiment of Ma'at, the divine order. Foreign domination meant the cosmos itself had fallen out of balance. Yet in adversity, Egypt found renewal. The Theban kings, though diminished, refused to surrender the idea of a united land. They paid tribute to the Hyksos at times, fought them at others, testing the fragile line between diplomacy and defiance. Among these southern rulers arose a lineage that would restore Egypt's soul: the 17th dynasty, descendants of the same Theban blood that had once reunited the country under Mentuhotep II. From this line came a succession of warrior kings whose names would be written in the chronicles of liberation: Sekenenre Tao, Kamose, and finally, Ahmose I. Their struggle would last decades, carried out not only on battlefields, but in the hearts of the people. The Thebans began to see themselves as the true heirs of Egypt's divine order, guardians of the gods, while the Hyksos were cast as the embodiment of Isfet, chaos. In temples and tombs, priests revived old hymns to Amun, the hidden god of Thebes, who represented the unseen force of renewal and destiny. To fight the Hyksos was no longer merely a matter of politics. It was a cosmic duty. Sekenenre Tao was the first to take up arms. His resistance began with skirmishes along the frontier. Records from the time describe his death as brutal, his skull shattered, perhaps in battle, perhaps in ritual execution by the Hyksos king Apophis. His sacrifice became legend, his name a cry of defiance that stirred Thebes to action. His successor, Kamose, continued the fight, pushing northward in daring raids that struck deep into Hyksos territory. His letters, preserved in fragments, reveal both his frustration and his resolve. "I will not share the land with a foreigner," he declared. "I will not rest until I have freed Egypt." The struggle was not easy. The Hyksos possessed superior weapons and fortified cities. Yet the Egyptians learned quickly. They adopted the chariot, forged their own bronze blades, and studied the tactics of their enemies. Each battle honed them. Each loss taught them adaptation. War became their crucible, a forge that tempered not only their weapons, but their identity. In resisting foreign rule, Egypt rediscovered itself. When Ahmose I finally ascended the throne, he inherited not a kingdom, but a mission. Young, determined, and guided by the memory of his ancestors, he led a campaign that would define his generation. Through years of relentless warfare, he drove the Hyksos back, city by city, until Avaris itself fell. The last of the foreign rulers fled across the Sinai, and the gates of Egypt were sealed once more. In that moment, more than a century of humiliation ended, and a new age began. Ahmose did not stop at liberation. He pursued the Hyksos into Palestine to ensure they would never return. Then, turning south, he subdued Nubia, reclaiming the gold mines that had once fueled the kingdom's power. For the first time in generations, the land of Egypt stood united, from the delta to the cataracts. The people saw in Ahmose not merely a warrior, but a restorer of Maat, the divine harmony. The temples rang again, with songs of victory and gratitude. The Theban god Amun, who had guided their struggle, now rose to supremacy. His name fused with that of Ra, the sun. Amun-Ra became the new symbol of divine kingship, invisible yet eternal, as if the gods themselves had been reborn through Egypt's trials. Thus ended the second intermediate period, not with the despair that had begun it, but with triumph. The centuries of division had taught Egypt hard truths: that no order endures without vigilance, that strength without wisdom invites decay, and that renewal is born only through struggle. Out of foreign occupation came innovation, resilience, and the rediscovery of unity. The people who once believed themselves unassailable had learned humility, and through humility, they found greatness once more. As the morning sun rose over the reclaimed land, its light glimmered on temples restored, on chariots newly forged, and on the calm surface of the Nile flowing northward, eternal as memory. Egypt had fallen into darkness and returned with fire in its heart. A new age was beginning, the new kingdom, the empire of glory and conquest, but beneath its triumphs would always flow the lesson of the Hyksos, that even gods must remember they are mortal, and only by losing themselves can they be reborn. The sun rose once more over Thebes, but this dawn was unlike any before it. Egypt, scarred by centuries of division and humiliation, stood united again under the banner of Ahmose I. The long night of foreign rule was over, and with the return of independence came a fire of purpose that would propel Egypt into its most dazzling era: the new kingdom, the empire of the Pharaohs, the golden age of gods and kings. The spirit of the nation, tempered by suffering, burned with renewed intensity. No longer content merely to survive, Egypt would now seek to conquer time itself. Ahmose I, the liberator, set the foundation. His campaigns against the Hyksos had not only expelled the invaders, but also transformed Egypt's military. For the first time, the kingdom commanded chariots, bronze weapons, and a professional standing army. The Egyptians had learned from their enemies and surpassed them. Under Ahmose, the borders expanded, Nubia was reclaimed, and trade routes reopened. The wealth of Africa and Asia began to flow once more into the Nile Valley. The people rejoiced, yet behind their celebrations lay a profound change. Egypt's vision of itself had evolved. The pharaoh was no longer merely a divine shepherd. He was a conqueror, the living embodiment of order imposed upon a chaotic world. In the generations that followed, this vision matured into empire. Under Thutmose I and his successors, Egypt crossed boundaries it had never dared approach. The pharaohs led their armies north into Canaan, east into Syria, and south into the deep heart of Nubia. Thutmose I brought Egyptian banners to the banks of the Euphrates, a feat that seemed to stretch the very imagination of what a Nile-born civilization could achieve. Yet Egypt's expansion was not only a matter of warfare, it was a form of cosmic rebalancing. Every campaign was declared an act of Maat, the divine order, against Isfet, the forces of disorder. Conquest became sanctified, and the pharaoh's victories were celebrated as the victories of the gods themselves. From this union of faith and ambition arose the most remarkable of rulers, Hatshepsut. A woman in a world of kings, she defied tradition with quiet brilliance. When her husband Thutmose II died, she became regent for his young son, but soon assumed full kingship, declaring herself Pharaoh. She wore the ceremonial beard of kingship, not as disguise, but as assertion that power, in its truest form, transcends gender. Under her rule, Egypt flourished not through war, but through peace, art, and trade. Hatshepsut's reign transformed the empire from a military power into a cultural beacon. Her expeditions to the land of Punt reopened ancient trade routes long forgotten, bringing back incense, myrrh, ivory, and exotic treasures that filled the temples of Thebes. She commissioned monuments of breathtaking beauty, the most magnificent of which still rises at Deir el-Bahari, a mortuary temple carved into the cliffs, its terraces aligned with the rising sun. It is not a fortress, but a poem in stone, dedicated to harmony between humanity, nature, and divinity. Hatshepsut's Egypt was an empire at peace with itself, a rare and fleeting moment when power found grace. Her successor, Thutmose III, inherited this peace and turned it into might. History remembers him as the Napoleon of Egypt, but his genius went beyond conquest. Over 17 campaigns, he extended Egyptian influence farther than any ruler before him, establishing an empire that stretched from the Fourth Cataract in Nubia to the banks of the Euphrates. His victories were not acts of destruction, but of integration. He allowed local rulers to remain, demanded tribute, and brought their sons to Egypt for education. In doing so, he built not merely an empire of land, but an empire of loyalty. The wealth that flowed into Egypt during his reign transformed Thebes into a city of gold. Temples expanded, artisans flourished, and scribes chronicled every victory with a devotion bordering on worship. The Temple of Amun at Karnak grew into one of the most awe-inspiring complexes in the ancient world, its columns rising like forests of stone, its walls inscribed with hymns to the god who had guided Egypt's resurgence. The cult of Amun became the state's spiritual core, and the pharaoh, his chosen son, was both warrior and priest. Egypt had never been more powerful, nor more certain of its divine destiny. Yet the closer a civilization moves toward perfection, the nearer it drifts to fragility. In the 14th century BCE, a radical shift would test Egypt's soul. Pharaoh Amenhotep IV ascended the throne and dared to challenge the foundation of its belief system. Declaring the sun disk Aten to be the one true god, he transformed religion itself, renaming himself Akhenaten, he who serves Aten, and building a new capital, Akhetaten, on the desert plain. The temples of Amun were closed, the old gods were silenced. Akhenaten's revolution was unprecedented. For the first time in recorded history, a ruler proclaimed monotheism, elevating one god above all others. But the transformation was too sudden, too absolute. The priests of Amun, long powerful and deeply entrenched, resisted silently. The people, confused and fearful, clung to the old ways. Akhenaten's art reflected his theology, elongated figures, intimate family scenes, human vulnerability. It was beautiful, honest, and alien to Egypt's timeless ideal of divine perfection. When Akhenaten died, the old order rushed back like the Nile after drought. His young successor, Tutankhaten, soon renamed Tutankhamun, restored the worship of Amun and returned the capital to Thebes. Though his reign was brief, his tomb would one day immortalize him, preserved untouched beneath the sands for more than 3,000 years. The treasures within, discovered in the 20th century, revealed not merely wealth, but an entire worldview, a civilization that sought eternity in craftsmanship and ritual, in gold, shaped to outlast decay. In the century that followed, Egypt regained stability and grandeur under pharaohs like Seti I and Ramses II. Seti rebuilt temples destroyed by Akhenaten's revolution and reaffirmed the sanctity of the gods. His son, Ramses II, Ramses the Great, became the very embodiment of royal power. His reign lasted over 6 decades, marked by colossal architecture and military might. His battle against the Hittites at Kadesh, though indecisive, was immortalized as a triumph in temple reliefs and hymns. From that conflict emerged one of the first recorded peace treaties in human history, a recognition that even the mightiest empires must eventually learn to coexist. Ramses II's monuments still dominate Egypt's landscape. The temples of Abu Simbel, carved from the living rock, their colossal statues facing the rising sun, and the Ramesseum, his mortuary temple, a vast ode to his own legacy. His age was the zenith of Egyptian confidence, its wealth unrivaled, its art mature, its gods triumphant. But beneath the glitter of abundance, the same patterns began to repeat. Extravagance led to strain, faith hardened into dogma, and the empire's vastness became difficult to sustain. By the time of Ramses IX, Egypt's unity was again fraying. The priests of Amun, enriched by centuries of tribute, had become a kingdom within a kingdom, ruling Thebes with near equal power to the pharaoh. Corruption and fatigue seeped into the administration. Foreign threats loomed once more, not from great empires, but from waves of migrating peoples, the mysterious sea peoples whose raids toppled kingdoms across the Mediterranean. Egypt survived them, but only barely. The cost was exhaustion, and when the storms passed, the empire that had once ruled from Syria to Nubia stood diminished. The new kingdom ended not in defeat, but in slow surrender to time. Yet its legacy was eternal. It gave the world the first peace treaty, monumental art of unmatched precision, and a vision of kingship that fused humanity with divinity. It was Egypt, at its most self-aware, a civilization that looked upon the sun and saw both God and mirror. As the centuries passed, the great temples fell silent, the statues eroded, the once mighty cities turned to dust. But the light of the new kingdom never vanished. It glows still in every fragment of hieroglyph, every carving, every whisper of desert wind that moves through the ruins of Thebes. For this was the age when Egypt reached beyond survival and touched the heavens. When human ambition and divine faith walked hand in hand across the sands of eternity. When the sun finally set on the empire of the new kingdom, it did not vanish in a single moment of catastrophe. It faded slowly, like the long twilight over the Nile. Egypt, which had once ruled from the mountains of Nubia to the rivers of Syria, began to retreat into itself. The monuments still stood, the temples still echoed with hymns, but their voices had grown hollow. The priests of Amun whispered their power in the halls of Thebes, while the pharaoh's decrees reached only as far as his treasury could stretch. The gods remained eternal, but the faith that had sustained them trembled beneath the weight of time. By 1069 BCE, the great age of empire had become memory. In the north, at Tanis, a new dynasty arose, seeking to rule through pragmatism rather than divine grandeur. In the south, Thebes remained a sacred city, but its rulers were no longer pharaohs of old. They were priests, custodians of rituals more ancient than they themselves understood. Egypt had become two lands again, not divided by war, but by exhaustion. The kingdom that had once embodied order now found itself fractured by the very complexity that had once made it great. The priests of Amun had grown powerful beyond measure during the new kingdom. They controlled vast estates, commanded laborers, and possessed wealth that rivaled the royal treasury. In a time when belief still defined authority, this power was absolute. The pharaohs, once gods among men, were now shadows beside the priesthood's temples. The balance between divine and mortal rule that had sustained Egypt for centuries tilted toward imbalance. Religion, once the heart of unity, became the instrument of division. Yet even as the old order decayed, Egypt's resilience refused to die. The North and South maintained a fragile coexistence, each claiming legitimacy, each invoking the same gods. The rulers of Tanis preserved diplomatic ties with neighboring lands, trading cedar from Lebanon and copper from Cyprus, while Theban priests continued to oversee the great festivals of Amun. For a time, the illusion of continuity endured. But the world around Egypt had changed. Across the Near East, new powers were rising. Assyria, Babylon, Persia. empires that wielded armies and iron, not divine lineage. When the Libyans came, they did not arrive as conquerors but as settlers, mercenaries long employed by Egyptian kings to guard the borders. Over generations, they had taken root, married into local families, and adopted Egyptian customs. By the 10th century BCE, their leaders claimed the throne. To many Egyptians, this was not an invasion, but a transformation of identity, the land absorbing its neighbors, as it had always done. Yet with each new dynasty, Egypt's essence thinned. The language remained the same, the gods unchanged. But the faith that bound them together weakened. The Libyan rulers, pragmatic and worldly, divided Egypt among their sons to maintain stability. But their policy only deepened fragmentation. Local rulers rose again, their autonomy unchecked. The Nile Valley became a mosaic of small principalities, each guarding its own interests. The unity of the Pharaohs, the idea that one heartbeat for all Egypt, had dissolved. And when Egypt stands divided, the desert always waits. From the south, a new power emerged, the Kingdom of Kush in Nubia. Once a colony under Egypt's rule, Nubia had absorbed its former master's culture, language, and religion. Its kings prayed to Amun, built temples like those at Karnak, and saw themselves as heirs of Egypt's divine tradition. Around 750 BCE, they marched north, not as destroyers, but as restorers. Under King Paye, the Kushite armies swept through the Nile Valley, uniting the fractured lands under their banner. To the Nubians, it was a sacred mission, a revival of the true faith of Amun. To the Egyptians, it was a bittersweet irony, for the torch of their civilization was being carried by those they once ruled. For a brief moment, under the 25th dynasty, Egypt found unity again. The Kushite kings ruled with reverence for the past, restoring temples, repairing monuments, and reviving the old rituals. The Empire of the South had become the guardian of Egyptian memory. But even this revival could not withstand the tide of history. From the east came the Assyrians, armed with iron and driven by empire. Their armies, disciplined and merciless, stormed the Nile Delta and sacked Thebes. The temples were looted, the priests scattered, and Egypt once again bowed before foreign masters. After the Assyrians came the Babylonians, and after them the Persians, each wave leaving behind new rulers, new administrators, and new scars. The Persians, under Cambyses and later Darius, treated Egypt not as a prize, but as a province. They respected its religion and kept its temples intact, but they ruled from afar. Their governors, the satraps, answerable only to the great king in Persepolis. Egypt, once the center of the world, had become a piece of another empire's map. Still, Egypt never surrendered its soul. Revolts flared again and again. Native princes rose from the delta, proclaiming the return of independence, only to be crushed or absorbed. For a few decades during the 26th dynasty, the so-called Site Renaissance, Egypt shone once more. From the city of Sai, the pharaoh Psamtik and his successors restored trade, art, and scholarship. The hieroglyphs were carved again with elegance, the statues once more serene. Greek merchants filled the ports of Naucratis, bringing with them new ideas and a glimpse of a wider world. For a moment it seemed Egypt might reawaken, but the illusion of rebirth could not withstand the reality of empire. The Persians returned in force, and Egypt fell once again under their dominion. The priests who had once resisted foreign gods now prayed for deliverance. The temples grew quieter, their rituals maintained by inertia rather than conviction. And then, in 332 BCE, deliverance came, but from a direction no one had foreseen. From the west, across the deserts and seas, marched Alexander of Macedon. At 24 years old, he had already conquered the Persian Empire, and Egypt lay in his path. The Persians fled before him. The Egyptians opened their gates. They hailed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. In his bearing they saw the reflection of the pharaohs of old, youthful, radiant, divinely favored. At Memphis, he was crowned as the son of Amun. He visited the oracle at Siwa, where the priests proclaimed him a god. For Egypt, it was a moment of déjà vu, a new master, but one who spoke in the language of eternity. Under Alexander, Egypt was not destroyed but reborn once again. He founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria, a place where Greek intellect and Egyptian mysticism would merge. It was a vision of universality, of knowledge as empire. But Alexander's dream was brief. He died young, leaving his conquests to be divided among his generals. One of them, Ptolemy, claimed Egypt as his own, beginning a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The story of that dynasty belongs to another age, but its roots lay here, in the twilight of native Egypt. By the time Alexander entered the land of the Nile, the ancient gods still stood in their temples, but their power had long faded. The language of the people had evolved. The old rites performed more out of duty than devotion. The civilization that had endured for 3,000 years did not die in conquest. It slowly transformed, becoming part of something greater and more complex, the Hellenistic world that would carry fragments of its wisdom into the future. As the last rays of the old Egypt sank into the horizon, what remained was not defeat, but continuity. The temples of Karnak and Luxor still reached toward the heavens. The inscriptions on their walls still sang of life, death, and rebirth. And the Nile, eternal as ever, continued to flow northward, bearing on its surface the reflections of ages past. Egypt had lost its crown, but not its spirit. In the quiet persistence of the river and the endurance of its monuments, the ancient promise lived on, that though empires may fade, the idea of Egypt is eternal. When Alexander the Great crossed the desert and entered Egypt in 332 BCE, the people did not resist him. They had seen too many conquerors come and go, the Persians, the Assyrians, the Nubians, each demanding tribute, each claiming divine sanction. But Alexander was different. He did not plunder temples or desecrate shrines. He came with reverence in his eyes and destiny in his hands. The priests at Memphis crowned him Pharaoh, the son of Amun, and the people knelt not out of fear, but out of recognition. For in him they saw something ancient and familiar, a ruler who sought not only power, but meaning. Egypt, weary yet wise, opened its arms to him as though welcoming a long-lost heir. Alexander's genius lay not merely in conquest, but in creation. As he gazed upon the Mediterranean coast near the mouth of the Nile, he envisioned a city unlike any the world had ever seen, a bridge between East and West, between the old gods and the new reason. He drew its plan in the sand himself, a perfect grid aligned with the sea and the heavens. He named it Alexandria. It would become not just a city but a symbol, the meeting of Greek intellect and Egyptian eternity, the heart of a new civilization that would outlast empires. But Alexander's dream was short-lived. Barely a decade later, he was dead, and his empire, vast and ungovernable, fractured among his generals. Egypt fell to Ptolemy, one of his most trusted companions, a man who understood both the sword and the soul. Ptolemy claimed the title of Pharaoh, not as an imitation, but as continuation. He embraced the customs of the land, wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and took on the divine roles expected of a king. In his rule, the fusion of 2 worlds began, the Hellenic and the Egyptian, logic and mystery, man and God. Under the Ptolemaic dynasty, Egypt entered one of the most remarkable periods of cultural synthesis in human history. The Ptolemies ruled as Greeks, but thought like pharaohs. They built temples to Egyptian gods in Greek architectural styles, blending Doric columns with hieroglyphic reliefs. They commissioned statues of Isis with the grace of Aphrodite, and of Serapis, a new god born from the union of Zeus and Osiris, who embodied both civilizations in a single divine form. Religion became not a source of division, but a language of unity, where every culture could find itself reflected in the divine mirror of Egypt. Alexandria rose quickly to become the intellectual and spiritual capital of the ancient world. Its lighthouse, the Pharaohs, towered above the sea, one of the seven wonders, its flame guiding ships from every shore. In its shadow stood the great library of Alexandria, the most ambitious repository of knowledge ever conceived. Ptolemy the Firm and his successors gathered scholars, poets, and philosophers from Greece, Persia, and India. They collected every scroll they could find, works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and poetry. Here, Euclid defined geometry. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the earth. Herophilus mapped the human body. Within those marble halls, humanity began to see knowledge itself as sacred, a continuation of the Egyptian quest for eternity, not through stone, but through understanding. Yet for all its brilliance, the Ptolemaic world was built upon delicate foundations. The early Ptolemies were strong, shrewd rulers. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, expanded trade and wealth, while Ptolemy III, Euergetes, led Egypt to victory abroad. The Nile Valley prospered as never before, its granaries overflowing, its ports alive with ships from every horizon. But the dynasty's success carried within it the seeds of decay. Wealth bred intrigue, power invited suspicion. The later Ptolemies turned inward, their court a labyrinth of jealousy, luxury, and betrayal. Royal siblings married and murdered one another, seeking legitimacy in divine blood and finding only isolation. While the kings quarreled, the world beyond Egypt changed again. Rome was rising, a republic no longer content to remain in the shadow of the Mediterranean. The Ptolemies, caught between grandeur and decline, began to rely on Roman favor to maintain their throne. Egypt, once the teacher of civilizations, became the pupil of foreign powers once more. Yet even in decline, the spirit of Egypt endured, and it would find its most enigmatic expression in the figure of a queen who would become legend, Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra was not the first woman to rule Egypt, but she was the last to do so with the full force of its ancient majesty. Educated in the libraries of Alexandria, fluent in several languages, including Egyptian, which many of her ancestors had never spoken, she embodied both intellect and charisma. To her people, she was Pharaoh reborn. To the world, she was the bridge between eras. She ruled not through conquest, but through persuasion, diplomacy, and grace. She understood that power in her time required alliance, and so she turned to Rome, the new empire that now ruled the world. Her relationships with Julius Caesar, and later with Mark Antony, were not merely affairs of passion, but of survival. With Caesar, she secured Egypt's independence. With Antony, she sought to build a new empire that could rival Rome itself. Together they dreamed of a Mediterranean ruled from Alexandria, a union of East and West under Egyptian light. But dreams, no matter how divine, are mortal. The tides of history moved against them. Octavian, the future Augustus, saw in their love not romance, but threat. His legions marched upon Egypt, and at Actium, Antony's fleet was destroyed. Cleopatra's end was not simply the fall of a queen, it was the closing of an age. Cornered by Rome's inevitability, she chose death over submission. In the myth that would outlive her, she took her own life by the bite of an asp, the serpent of royalty, the symbol of eternal return. In that final act, she became what every pharaoh sought to be, a legend, immortal in memory, if not in body. When she died in 30 BCE, so too did the line of the pharaohs. The land that had once built the pyramids and ruled the known world became a province of Rome. And yet, even as the eagle of Rome replaced the double crown, Egypt did not truly die. The temples of Isis continued their rituals for centuries. The cults of Serapis and Horus spread across the Roman world. The wisdom of Alexandria laid the foundation for the philosophy and science that would shape the modern age. The Egyptian vision of eternity, of life as a cycle, of death as transformation, found new life in the mysteries of Greece and the faiths of the West. The Ptolemaic age, for all its contradictions, achieved what no empire before or after could. It merged the rational clarity of Greece with the sacred depth of Egypt. It was a brief but brilliant flame, the moment when the world's oldest civilization and its newest conquerors met not as enemies, but as mirrors. And though the sands of time have buried their temples and burned their libraries, something of that light still lingers. In the geometry of architecture, in the rhythms of thought, in the eternal question of how mortals might touch the divine. When night falls over the ruins of Alexandria, the wind carries whispers from both worlds. Somewhere between the broken columns and the sleeping sea, one can almost hear the echo of that impossible dream. A civilization that refused to die, even as it became something else. The Greeks gave Egypt a new language, but Egypt gave the Greeks eternity. And from their union was born not just a city or a kingdom, but the very idea of civilization itself. A bridge across time, where wisdom, beauty, and faith meet under the same eternal sky. When the last breath left Cleopatra's body, and the asp curled lifeless at her side, the world shifted. The age of the Pharaohs, 3,000 years of divine kingship, of pyramids and temples, of gods who shaped the sun and stars, was over. In its place stood a new order, colder and pragmatic, ruled not by the rhythm of the Nile, but by the will of Rome. In 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of the greatest empire the West had yet known. To the Romans, it was the granary of the world. To the Egyptians, it was the end of their eternity. Yet, as it had done so many times before, Egypt did not vanish. It adapted, it transformed, it survived. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, understood the power of symbols. He entered Egypt not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order. The priests of Isis and Amun were allowed to continue their rituals, the temples remained open, and the pharaoh's duties were assumed by the emperor himself. In the inscriptions carved by local artisans, Augustus was depicted not as a foreign invader, but as a pharaoh, the son of Ra, offering gifts to the gods of the Nile. The illusion of continuity was perfect. But beneath that surface, everything had changed. The divine monarchy had been replaced by imperial administration. The heart of the empire now beat not in Thebes or Memphis, but in distant Rome. For the Romans, Egypt was too precious to trust to senators or generals. It was ruled directly by the emperor through a prefect, a man of equestrian rank who answered only to Caesar himself. Egypt became the emperor's personal possession, a crown jewel to feed the Roman people and finance the legions that guarded the frontiers of Europe and Asia. The Nile, which had sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia, now flowed for Rome. Each year, ships heavy with grain sailed northward to the Mediterranean, their cargo feeding the masses of the eternal city. Egypt, once the center of the world, had become its servant. And yet, the soul of Egypt did not die. The temples still thrummed with life. In the shadow of the pyramids, priests recited hymns to Ra and Horus, to Isis and Osiris, just as their ancestors had done for generations. The Roman emperors themselves often sought favor from these gods, fearing their mystery and power. Augustus repaired temples, Tiberius offered gifts to the priests of Dendera, and Hadrian built sanctuaries to Isis across the empire. Egyptian religion spread far beyond the desert. It reached Rome, Pompeii, and even the frontiers of Britain. The goddess Isis, mother of magic and resurrection, became one of the most beloved deities of the ancient world. In her eyes, Romans saw not a foreign divinity, but the reflection of their own longing for eternity. Alexandria, too, remained a beacon of intellect and faith. Its library may have burned, but its legacy endured. Under Roman rule, the city became a meeting place for cultures and religions. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Romans all mingled in its crowded streets. Its scholars studied medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, while its priests guarded mysteries older than time. It was in Alexandria that ideas would converge to shape the spiritual destiny of the Western world. As the centuries passed, however, the balance began to shift. The old gods grew silent as a new faith spread across the Mediterranean, a faith born not of pyramids or temples, but of revelation and redemption. Christianity took root first among the humble, then among the scholars. By the 1st century CE, it had reached Alexandria, where the Jewish philosopher Philo and later early Christian thinkers sought to reconcile divine mystery with human reason. The city that had once worshipped the sun now turned its eyes to a single unseen god. Rome itself changed. Emperors came and went, the empire expanded and fractured. Yet Egypt remained constant, a province of light and labor, its people harvesting grain, crafting papyrus, and mummifying their dead in quiet defiance of new faiths. Even as Christianity grew, the cults of Isis and Serapis endured. Their processions filled the streets of Alexandria with incense and song, their temples glowed with oil lamps at dusk. To the Romans, Egypt was still the land of eternity, a place where death was not an end, but a passage. By the 3rd century, the empire was faltering. Civil wars, economic collapse, and foreign invasions left scars on every province. But Egypt, as always, proved resilient. Its Nile continued to flood, its people to sow and reap. When Diocletian reformed the empire, dividing it into east and west, Egypt became one of the pillars of the Eastern realm. Yet this stability came at a cost. Diocletian, seeking to suppress rebellion, launched brutal persecutions against Christians in Alexandria and beyond. Blood was spilled where once papyrus had borne the words of poets and philosophers. The Nile, eternal witness to humanity's contradictions, carried away the tears of martyrs and the dust of temples alike. Then came Constantine. With his conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century, the empire itself was transformed. The gods of Egypt were officially silenced, their temples closed or turned to ruins. Alexandria, however, rose again, this time as a center of Christian theology. The city gave birth to some of the earliest debates on the nature of God and the divinity of Christ. But those same debates, fierce and unyielding, also tore the city apart. Pagan against Christian, Christian against Christian, the streets once filled with philosophers now ran with the anger of zealots. The Serapeum, the grand temple dedicated to Serapis, was destroyed in 391 CE by mobs driven by faith and vengeance. With its fall, the ancient heart of Egyptian religion finally stopped beating. The last embers of the old world lingered for another century. In the south, the temple of Isis at Philae continued its rituals in defiance of imperial decrees. Pilgrims still came, whispering prayers in a language already ancient. But in 537 CE, under the rule of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, even that sanctuary fell silent. The last priests were dispersed, and the gods of Egypt, who had guided the sun, judged the dead, and measured the stars, were finally exiled from the living world. Yet Egypt itself, as it always had, endured. Its people still rose with the dawn, sowed their crops with the floods, and spoke to their ancestors through memory and ritual. The spirit of continuity, the belief that life and death are threads of the same fabric, remained unbroken. Even under Rome and Byzantium, the Egyptian soul persisted, muted, transformed, but alive. The Coptic Christians who came to dominate its faith inherited that same ancient reverence for resurrection, for eternal life beyond the tomb. By the time the Roman world itself began to crumble, Egypt had already outlasted it in spirit. The pyramids still stood, their stones glowing gold in the morning sun. The hieroglyphs, though unread, still whispered from their walls. Beneath them lay the unspoken truth that every conqueror would learn and forget. That power fades, empires collapse, but the river flows forever. Under Rome, Egypt lost its crown, but gained immortality of another kind. It became the cradle of faith, the crossroads of worlds, the keeper of the memory of humanity's oldest dreams. When the last imperial legions withdrew and the Byzantine banners fluttered over Alexandria, The Nile continued to bear witness to the endless dance of time. The gods may have departed, but the silence they left behind was not death. It was eternity. Beneath the vast and unbroken sky of Egypt, time moves differently. The sands shift, the river rises and falls, empires come and go, but the essence of the land endures. It has seen conquerors crowned and forgotten, gods worshipped and silenced, cities built and buried beneath their own dust. Yet through it all, Egypt remains, not as a relic of the past, but as a mirror of eternity, a reminder that civilization, like the Nile, may bend but never break. The true legacy of Egypt is not its monuments, though they defy centuries, nor its kings, though their names still echo in stone. Its legacy lies in an idea that life is a cycle, not a line, that death is transformation, not end, that memory, art, and faith are bridges across the abyss of time. In every obelisk that touches the sun, in every carving that endures the wind, there speaks the same conviction, that humanity's search for meaning can outlast mortality itself. From the Old Kingdom's pyramids to the whispers of Coptic prayers, Egypt has been humanity's longest meditation on the eternal. It taught the world to write, to build, to dream of the divine. Its gods have faded, but their shadows still shape our imagination. Its tombs have been opened, yet they continue to guard the secret of wonder. To stand before the ruins of Thebes or gaze upon the Sphinx is to feel that eternity is not a place, but a presence, a quiet persistence that hums beneath all things living and dead. Egypt does not belong to history. History belongs to Egypt. For in its silence, the world hears the oldest truth ever spoken. Nothing that was loved is ever truly lost.